Welcome to the Strive for Iron podcast. This is a place where you're just going to hear some things that you won't hear anywhere else. We dig into what Scripture says. We don't eisegete, which means putting into Scripture what is not there, which is very common in the modern cultural church. They inject into Scripture their own agenda, their own confirmation bias, the way they think things ought to be biblically. We refuse to do that. What we want to do is draw out of Scripture what it actually says. This poor lady has been misread, misaligned, misdescribed, twisted, contorted, made into somebody she's not, more than anybody in Scripture other than Christ himself. And that being Deborah. Whenever they want to argue in favor of women preachers, you can bet Deborah's name's going to come up. And somehow, and nobody can ever explain to me how this works, somehow an Old Testament civil judge has bearing on the New Testament Christian church. Don't understand that. They can't explain it, but yet they still do it. So what I want to do today is actually bring out who Deborah really was. What does Scripture say? Nothing inserted in, nothing changed. Who was Deborah? We're going to get into that in just a moment. Today, we're going to be breaking through the smoke screens, and I want you to have a better understanding of who this wonderful woman of God actually was and the roles that she fulfilled. We have all seen it. I have seen it. You have seen it, where Deborah is portrayed in the leather garb with a huge sword in her hand, and she is proclaimed as this great warrior princess, like what's her name, Xena. Unfortunately, a great majority of Christians today think that that's who she was. They have this idea of Deborah vanquishing armies and toppling nations, and the reality is it's just not at all accurate. When we look at the book of Judges, there's some things that stand out to me. Now, God clearly said in Judges chapter 2 and 16, in verse 16, it says, "Then the Lord raised up judges who rescued them from the hands of those who robbed them." So God raised up these men to save Israel from oppressors. And we go through the book of Judges, and let me point out this. He did not say that he raised up every judge. It just says that he raised up judges. And so, you can look in chapter 3 and verse 9. It says, "But when the Israelites cried out to the Lord for help, the Lord raised up a man to rescue the people of Israel." And then in chapter 3 and verse 15, it says, "But when the Israelites cried out to the Lord for help, the Lord raised up a man to rescue them." And then in chapter 3 and verse 31, it says, "After Ehud became Shamgar, the son of Anath, who struck down 600 Philistines, men with an ox goad, who saved Israel." Then you have in chapter 4, verse 4, it says, "Now Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lipidoth, was judging Israel at that time." You see something? Did something stand out to you? The previous one specifically said God raised up this judge to deliver Israel. And then we get to Deborah, and it just says she judged Israel during that time. And if you continue on through, there's some judges that are basically just mentioned by name. It never tells anything about them or what they did or did not do. But the ones that actually give us a backstory, the pattern is the same. God raised up these men. These men stepped up and delivered Israel from oppression. Samson was a great example of that. But Deborah is the only judge of those that give us a backstory that did not deliver Israel from anything. Deborah did not deliver Israel, and we'll get into that. Scripture does not say that every single judge was sent by God. We also have to understand that judges had different roles. To be a judge in Israel was understood to be a civil position. It was not necessarily a ruler. Some of them definitely ruled. Some of them did not. Othniel delivered Israel. Ehud killed the king of Moab. Shamgar killed 600 Philistines and delivered Israel. Gideon delivered Israel from the Midianites. Abimelech defeated Gaal. Tola delivered Israel. Jephthah defeated the Amorites. But again, Deborah defeated no one. She did not fight anyone, and she did not deliver Israel. That was actually done by Barak, and we'll get into that. Deborah, it says, actually sat under a tree and gave advice, and she also gave judgment. She touched Israel through her wisdom. She helped them. She guided them. But there's nothing that says that she ruled the land. Judges were not, and I want you to understand this. Judges were not church leaders. They did not lead in the temple. They did not prophesy in the temple. They were not doctrinal authorities. They were not priests or teachers in worship. Judges existed because normal leadership had collapsed. The only reason the judges had to come on, look at the story, go through the book of Judges and look at the story. The story is always the same. Israel did stupid things. They got caught. They started worshiping other gods. They got pulled into sin, and eventually they got to the point where they were repentant, and they cried out unto God and said, help us, save us, get us out of here. God raised up a judge. The judge defeated the enemies, and that Israel was delivered. That's the pattern. You see it all through the book of Judges. Now, let me take a moment and say this. If you like the content of this video, and if it speaks to you and helps you at all, please subscribe. It would really help us. It would be a great benefit to us and a blessing to us. So please subscribe, like, share, make a comment. Tell us if you think we're right, wrong, or, are we on base, off base? Please let us know. The channel is starting to grow. I believe it's going to pick up steam because we're touching on things that a lot of people just won't do. We'd greatly appreciate your help with that. So let's get into what exactly Deborah did. In chapter 4 and verse 5, and we already touched on this, it says she used to sit and hear and decide disputes under a palm tree of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim. And the Israelites came up to her for judgment. She also delivered a message from the Lord. She went to Barak, she kicked him in the backside, and she said, get up. This is what the Lord said. In verse 6, it says, behold, the Lord, the God of Israel, has commanded, go and march to Tabor and take with you 10,000 men of war. She goaded Barak into fulfilling his role. In verse 8, it says, if you will go with me, then I will go up. Coward. Barak was a coward. Well, Deborah, woman, if you'll go up with me, I'll go up. And she said, I will certainly go with you, verse 9, to the river Kishon. But Deborah pointed out, let me say that again. Deborah pointed out this. The journey that you're about to take will not be for your honor and glory, because the Lord will sell Sisera into the hands of a woman. Was she talking about herself? No. She was talking about Jael, who killed Sisera. But the point is, Deborah understood that an army falling to a woman was shameful. It was shameful for the ones who lost, obviously, and it was shameful for the nation who allowed it to happen. She understood this. I mean, let me say it like this. If Deborah had led the armies of Israel that day, it would have been a shame and a disgrace for the armies of Sisera to fall to Deborah. That would have been a shame. It would have been disgraceful for that to have happened. It would have been shameful and a disgrace for Deborah, a woman, to lead Israel as a ruler. That would have been a shame and a disgrace for that to happen. You see this brought out in Isaiah chapter 3 and verse 12. It says, oh, my people, let me set a stage here. He's not saying that the leaders of Israel were female. He was saying the leaders of Israel behaved like females. This is what he said. Oh, my people. Children are their oppressors, and women rule over them. God was literally saying that the men were so bad at leadership, it was like they were being led by women. Oh, my people, children are their oppressors, and women rule over them. Oh, my people, your leaders lead you astray. Who's that? The men who lead like women. And confuse, destroy, and swallow up the direction of your paths. So this is what Deborah did. She accompanied Barak. She did not lead Barak. She did not lead the armies. She literally accompanied the man to Kadesh. And the other thing that Deborah did, she wrote a song. She wrote a song. This is what she did not do. She did not lead men in worship. Deborah did not stand in the tabernacle. She did not offer sacrifices. She did not teach the Torah publicly. She did not establish doctrine. Even her prophetic role was situational. Now, it was Deborah a prophetess? Absolutely. We'll be getting into that. But here's the difference, and I challenge you to do it. Look at Isaiah. Look at Jeremiah. Look at Ezekiel. Look at Elijah. Look at Elisha. All these prophets of God, these men, prophets of God, and then compare them to Deborah. Do you see the same thing? Did Deborah operate that same way? Look at that and see. See what you see. Ultimately, we don't really know how deep of a role Deborah played in the leadership of Israel. It doesn't appear that she really had any direct leadership role. But what we do know is she held a civil position where she gave advice and she judged disputes. That's what Deborah did. And then people will quote verse 7, and I've had them do this to me where they'll quote and it says, "Until I, Deborah, arose." Verse 7. See? Deborah arose. That shows that she was the leader. That shows that she was in charge. She was the ruler. Funny, though, they fail to mention the rest of the verse, where the very same verse says, "Until I arose a mother in Israel." Deborah literally considered herself a mother to Israel. She considered herself in the position of a nurturing mother. People also quote verse 12 where it says, "Awake, awake, Deborah." See, that shows that she's the leader. That shows she's the head. But just like before, they failed to quote the very next line where it says, "Awake, awake, sing a song." Awake, awake, sing a song. Nothing about being the leader, nothing about being the head. Or the next line after that, it says, "Arise, who? Barak, and lead away your captives, you son of Abinoam." Arise, Barak, and lead away your captives. Arise, Deborah, sing a song. Seems pretty clear to me. Never in the whole text where Deborah, the story of Deborah, Judges 4 and 5, is it ever said that Deborah is described as a leader, a head, a ruler of anything. She's never described that way. But she was a prophetess. There we go. They got me. She was a prophetess. That equates her with all those prophets I mentioned. That she's a prophet. She's just like Moses. But the problem is the word for prophetess in Hebrew actually means an inspired woman. She was that. She actually did go to Barak and deliver a message from God to Barak on a personal level. Wonderful. She was inspired by God. Don't argue that. But then it says, by implication, she was a poetess. So Deborah was a prophetess because she was a poetess. She wrote songs. And it goes on from there, and it says, by association, a prophet's wife. So a prophet's wife was called a prophetess. Now, some people claim that Deborah's husband was a prophet. I don't know that. There's no evidence of that. But what we do know is that she wrote a song. So there, by definition, she is a prophetess. So again, I want to touch on something that's extremely important. When somebody brings up Deborah, when they're trying to push for women preachers or women pastors in the New Testament, and they bring up Deborah, the first thing that should come out of your mouth is this: Deborah, or an Old Testament judge, has absolutely no bearing on the New Testament church. Deborah has nothing to do with the New Testament church. What God did with Deborah, even if she was this warrior princess that they claim she was, even if she was a prophet like Elijah and Elisha, Isaiah, even if she was that, it has no bearing on the New Testament church. So it's the whole argument shot down right there, right off the cuff. So why do cultural Christians like to promote Deborah? Why do they like to go to her? Why do they like to put Deborah into roles that Scripture does not? Because in their mind, if you can make Deborah a military conqueror or a national leader, that somehow justifies them being able to erase what Paul said in his clear instructions in the New Testament concerning women. Deborah was a great warrior, therefore I can ignore 1 Timothy chapter 2, 1 Corinthians chapter 14, Titus 2, Colossians 3, you go down the list. I can erase all that because Deborah was a great warrior. The very argument is absurd. Basically, they're confusing civil leadership with spiritual office. The two are not connected. You might as well say that lady that is CEO of Cracker Barrel and has created such havoc over there, well, she's the CEO of Cracker Barrel, therefore women can be preachers. The two things are not connected. There's no relationship. And then they'll argue and say, well, if God will use Deborah to lead armies, surely he will use a woman to lead the church. Well, here's the problem. Nowhere did Paul or any other apostle or any writer of scripture ever implicitly state a woman cannot lead an army. They never did, but it doesn't specifically forbid them from doing that. But scripture does specifically forbid women from leading the church. So that argument does not work on its face. So get back to what a prophetess is. Well, there's several of them in the Old Testament. What did Miriam do? Do you remember? She sang songs and she danced. She was a prophetess. What did Deborah do? She wrote a song. She was a prophetess. What did Hilda do? She delivered a message outside the temple and not in relation to public worship. She was a prophetess. But not one woman in all of the Old Testament was allowed to be a priest or to lead or teach in the temple. It was forbidden. It was not allowed. Just like in the New Testament church, remember in 1 Corinthians 14, Paul says that women are to be silenced, and he says, as saith the law, the same thing. They weren't allowed to be priests. They weren't allowed to lead in the temple. They weren't allowed to teach in the temple. Come to the New Testament, no woman in the New Testament was allowed to be a preacher or a pastor or lead in the church. The two things are connected. But didn't Deborah lead the armies that defeated Sisera? Didn't she lead the charge against them? I've heard this countless times. This is what the text says. Now they're on Mount Tabor in Kadesh. Deborah says to Barak, arise, for this day the Lord has given Sisera into whose hand? Whose hand? Barak's, your hand. Has the Lord not gone out before you? So Barak went down from Mount Tabor with 10,000 men following him, and the Lord routed Sisera and all of his chariots. Where was Deborah? She was still back at Mount Tabor. Barak went down from Mount Tabor. Deborah was nowhere near the battle. She wasn't involved in the battle. And this is borne out in the other places where this is mentioned in scripture. In 1 Samuel chapter 12, in verse 11, this story is touched on, and the story speaks of Barak, not Deborah. Her name is not mentioned. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 32, Barak is mentioned in relation to this story, not Deborah. She is never mentioned again. And then we get into Judges chapter 5, and Deborah has this song, and the two of them sing this song, and it celebrates victory, and it public rebukes male passivity. This song openly rebukes the very thing that led to Deborah even being in the position she was in. Deborah, the only reason Deborah was even considered a judge is because men were weak. Men let down on their roles. And she praises Jael for doing what men failed to do. This woman defeated the king because the men failed to do it. And here's the irony that nobody speaks about. They ignore it. Deborah's story does not elevate women into leadership. It exposes men for their failed leadership. Using Deborah to argue for women pastors misses the rebuke. Just like it's a rebuke for women to have to rise up to be a judge, it is a rebuke for a woman to rise up and become a pastor. These are roles that were not designed for them, and they should not be filling. If a woman is standing behind a pulpit pretending to be a preacher, there are cowards and wimps and feckless men sitting in that congregation that allowed it to happen. Her husband allowed it to happen. Her father allowed it to happen, and it should have never happened. Yes, I said it, and I'm proud of it. This reverses the whole lesson. Instead of understanding weak men lead to women being in positions they're not supposed to be in, they reverse the whole thing and say, see, women can be in that role now. It's okay for women to be in that role, and rewrite the whole text to conform to modern sensibilities. That's what the whole goal is. We got to make Deborah bolster our preconceived ideas or our confirmation bias. So, in closing, Deborah is not the problem. Male abdication is the problem. The story does not ask, why did God allow a woman to lead? The story asked, where were the men? Why was this woman even in that position? And if the whole story of Deborah bothers you, it should. It definitely should. Listen, like, share, subscribe, make some comments, ask some questions, join in. We'd love to have you. Appreciate it. May the Lord bless you and give you a powerful week.